Welcome, listeners. Today we're taking a deep dive into a fascinating corner of Greek mythology, the Moirai, better known as the Fates.
The fates, absolutely. Always a popular topic. Seems like humans have always been, well, kind of obsessed with destiny.
Yeah,
The forces that shape our lives.
yeah, that makes sense. So where should we start with the Moirai? I mean, we've got a few sources here, mainly Wikipedia entries for Atropos, Clotho, Fates, Lachesis, and Moirai.
Sounds like a good starting point to me. Wikipedia is always a good overview, at least.
Yeah, definitely. And I gotta say, one thing that surprised me when I was doing a little reading beforehand is that the Fates weren't always a trio. Did you know that?
Yeah. That's pretty interesting. We usually picture them as that iconic trio, right? The three goddesses weaving and measuring and cutting the thread of life. But it looks like that idea might have, evolved over time.
Okay, so maybe we should clarify something right off the bat.
Yeah.
The Moirai, they weren't just about death, right? They were like about a person's whole destiny.
Yeah, exactly. It's easy to get caught up in that image of Atropos and the whole cutting the thread thing. But the Moirai were involved in the entire lifespan, from beginning to end.
So not just bringers of death, they were more like the architects of destiny itself.
Exactly. They were the ones who determined what your life would be, how it would play out.
Huh. Like a cosmic tapestry or something, with each life as a thread.
Yeah, I like that. A cosmic tapestry. And to understand that tapestry, we need to meet the weavers, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Each sister plays a very specific role in this whole dance of fate.
So who kicks things off? Who gets the ball rolling, so to speak?
Well, that would be Clotho, the spinner. She's the youngest of the three, and she's the one who creates the thread of life. So picture her with a distaff and spindle, spinning that thread at the moment of your birth.
Ah, so her name actually comes from the Greek word for to spin.
That's right. It's a pretty literal connection. She spins the thread of your destiny right from the start.
That's pretty amazing how they use these everyday objects to explain these huge abstract concepts. What about Lachesis? What does she do?
Lachesis is the measurer, the middle sister. She determines the length of that thread, how long your life will be. She's often depicted with a measuring rod. It's kind of symbolizing that role.
So her name means something like to measure.
It's a little more nuanced than that, actually. Her name comes from a word that means to obtain by lot. So it's not just about measuring time. It's about, this portion or share that you're given, which is interesting when you think about it.
Okay, so Lachesis measures how long you live. But does she also decide, what kind of life you have, like good or bad, happy or sad?
That's where it gets a little tricky. Some sources say she just measures lifespan, but others suggest she had a bigger role, like actually shaping destiny.
Huh. So it sounds like maybe we don't know for sure.
Yeah, there's some debate there. It's possible that she was involved in both. Not just measuring the time, but also influencing what happens during that time, the joys and sorrows, the triumphs and tragedies.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about Atropos? She seems pretty straightforward, right?
Atropos is the eldest, the inevitable. She's the one who cuts the thread of life, often depicted with shears, so it's a pretty potent image, I think.
Definitely. So the three sisters working together. Clotho spins, Lachesis measures, and Atropos cuts. It's amazing how these ancient ideas can still resonate with us. This idea of life as a thread being spun and measured and cut.
It's a powerful image for sure. And even though the Moirai were goddesses, they represented a force that even the other gods had to respect.
Really? Even Zeus. I mean, he's the king of the gods.
That's right. But even Zeus was subject to the decrees of the Moirai.
Wow, that's interesting. So they were even more powerful than the gods.
It seems that way. It's like even the most powerful beings in the cosmos were still bound by this force of destiny. It makes you wonder about the ancient Greeks' understanding of power. Like, what were the limits of even divine authority?
It's almost paradoxical, right? You've got these powerful gods ruling the universe, but they're still tied to a destiny that they can't escape.
Right. And this tension between divine power and the unyielding nature of fate, it pops up in a lot of Greek myths. Remember the story of Zeus and his son Sarpedon in the Iliad?
Refresh my memory.
Okay, so Zeus knows that Sarpedon is fated to die in the Trojan War. And even though Zeus is the king of the gods, he can't do anything to prevent it.
Oh, right. He's heartbroken, but he can't save his own son.
Exactly. Even Zeus, with all his might, can't alter fate's course. It really highlights this idea of accepting the inevitable, even for the most powerful being in the cosmos.
Wow. So even the gods had to accept their fate. I wonder what the ancient Greeks thought about free will. Did they believe in it at all?
That's a great question. It's something philosophers have debated for centuries. But before we go there, I think it's worth talking about the Moirai's parentage, because it turns out that there are some pretty interesting discrepancies in the sources.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, Hesiod, in his Theogony, initially describes the Moirai as the daughters of Nyx.
Nyx.
Yeah, the primordial goddess of night. So they're born from darkness itself without a father. It's a pretty powerful image.
It sounds like they were like this primal force,
Yeah,
even older than the Olympian gods.
exactly. But then later on in the Theogony, Hesiod gives them a different set of parents.
Wait, really? He changes his mind.
Yeah, he says they're actually the daughters of Zeus and Themis.
Hold on. Zeus, the king of the gods, and Themis, the goddess of, what was it again?
Divine order, law, and justice.
Right, right. So first they're daughters of darkness, and then they're daughters of the most powerful god and the embodiment of order. It's a pretty big shift.
It is. So what are we supposed to make of that? Were these just different traditions that got woven together over time, or was there something more going on? Like, were the ancient Greeks actually debating the nature of fate itself?
That's a good question. Were the Moirai this primal force that predated the gods, or were they ultimately subject to a higher order, like the order represented by Zeus and Themis?
Exactly. It's a fascinating dilemma. And to make things even more complicated, Plato had a different idea about their parentage. He said they were the daughters of Ananke.
Ananke. Now, who was she again?
Ananke is the personification of necessity. So in Plato's view, fate wasn't just some arbitrary thing. It was an expression of this fundamental principle that governed everything.
Wow. 3 different sets of parents, 3 different ways of looking at fate.
Yeah.
It's almost like the ancient Greeks were wrestling with some pretty big questions about, the forces that control our lives. Do we have any say in what happens to us, or is it all predetermined?
Exactly. And those questions are still relevant today, aren't they? We still grapple with the same ideas. Fate versus free will. Destiny versus choice. It's a timeless human dilemma.
It is. And that's something we're going to keep exploring in this deep dive. But before we get too deep into the philosophical weeds, I think it's important to remember that this idea of fate, this idea of destiny, it's not unique to the Greeks. Lots of cultures have similar concepts.
Oh, absolutely. It's a universal human fascination, I think. This desire to understand the forces that shape our lives, to know what the future holds.
Yeah. So let's take a look at some of those other cultures. Where else do we find this idea of fate?
Well, the Norse, for example, they have the Norns, Urar, Verandi, and Skuld. And like the Moirai, they're 3 female figures who weave the destinies of gods and men.
So another trio of women controlling fate. It's interesting how that pattern pops up in different cultures.
Right. It is. But the Norse take the weaving metaphor even further. Their loom isn't just a symbol, it's actually located at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree. So it's like their whole cosmology is connected to this idea of fate being woven into the fabric of existence.
Wow, that's pretty cool. What about the Romans? Did they have their own version of the fates?
Definitely. They had the Parse, Nona, Decima, and Morta. And just like the Moirai, they each had a specific role: spinning, measuring, and cutting the thread of life.
So it's like this archetype, these 3 female figures who control destiny. It appears again and again across different cultures.
Exactly. It speaks to something very fundamental about the human experience, this anxiety about the unknown, this desire to understand and maybe even influence the forces that shape our lives.
Yeah, I get that. But to really get a handle on the Greek perspective, I think we need to dig into the word Moirai itself. Like, where does it come from, and what does it tell us about how they viewed fate?
You're right. The etymology of the word can reveal a lot. So, Moirai actually comes from an ancient Greek word that means lots, destinies, apportioners. And that last part, apportioners, is really interesting.
Apportioners, what do you mean?
Well, it suggests that fate wasn't just some preordained path, it was an apportionment, like a dividing up of experiences, joys and sorrows, triumphs and tragedies.
So it's not just about accepting a path that's already been laid out for you. It's about understanding that life is made up of all these different elements, these different experiences, and the Moirai are the ones who decide how much of each you get.
Precisely. And that ties into this broader idea of cosmic order, this sense that everything has its allotted place and portion, like a cosmic balance sheet or something.
A cosmic balance sheet. I like that. So it's not just about individual destinies. It's about this grand universal balance.
Exactly. And that makes me think about the concept of cosmic justice, the idea that the universe ultimately strives for balance, rewarding good and punishing evil. It makes you wonder if the Moirai played a role in that too.
Yeah. Maybe they were like cosmic accountants or something. making sure everyone gets what they deserve.
It's an interesting thought. And you know what's even more intriguing? This idea of portion or share, it actually connects to the word merit. So even rewards, even the good things you get in life, they were tied to your Moira, your destiny.
So it wasn't just about blind fate, it was about deserving what you got. That's pretty different from how we usually think about fate. We tend to think of it as something that just happens to you, whether you deserve it or not.
Right. But for the Greeks, it seems like there was a connection between destiny and deservingness, which again adds another layer of complexity to how they understood fate.
Yeah, this is getting pretty complicated. So to recap, the Greek understanding of fate wasn't just about accepting a preordained path. It was about navigating life within a framework of destiny, striving for virtue, even as you acknowledge the limits of your control.
Exactly. And it's crucial to remember that even though they were powerful, the Moirai were still worshipped as goddesses. People made offerings to them, not just out of fear, but out of a desire to appease them, to maybe find favor within the framework of their predetermined destiny.
So it wasn't just resignation, it was like acknowledging this powerful force and trying to live in harmony with it.
Right. And that brings us back to that question we were talking about earlier, free will. If
Yeah.
everything is predetermined, how did the Greeks reconcile that with their belief in human agency? Like, did our choices actually matter?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. How can you have both predetermination and choice? Did the ancient Greeks have an answer to that?
I don't think they had one simple answer, but their myths offer some intriguing clues. Like the Moirai themselves, they weren't depicted as these emotionless robots just carrying out a fixed plan. They had personalities, they even argued with each other sometimes.
Right, like in that story about King Admetus and his wife Alcestis.
Exactly. She tricked the Moirai into getting drunk so she could plead for her husband's life, which suggests that there was some flexibility in the system. The Moirai were powerful, but maybe they weren't entirely unyielding.
So it wasn't completely rigid. Maybe fate was more like a flowing river. You've got this powerful current, but you can still navigate it, maybe even redirect it a little, if you're skillful enough.
I like that analogy.
So maybe the Greeks believed that even though your ultimate destination might be set, you still had some control over how you got there.
And the way the Moirai were worshipped reinforces that idea. People made offerings not just out of fear, but with the hope of influencing their decisions.
So maybe they believed that even though your ultimate destiny might be set, you could still nudge things in a favorable direction. Like sweeten the deal a little bit. Get a slightly better fate.
It's like they recognized the power of fate, but they didn't just give up. They still tried to work within that system to maybe nudge things in a more favorable direction. And it raises the question, did the Greeks see fate and free will as mutually exclusive?
So maybe they didn't see fate and free will as like totally separate things. Maybe they saw them as two sides of the same coin.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. Like, your choices still mattered. They shaped your experience, they determined your legacy, and maybe, just maybe, they could even influence your fate in the afterlife.
Okay, so it wasn't a free-for-all, but it wasn't completely deterministic either. There was some middle ground, some interplay between fate and free will.
Right. And remember that connection between Moira and merit that we talked about earlier? That suggests that rewards, the good things you get in life, weren't just random. They were tied to your actions, your deservingness.
Right. So your choices had consequences, even if those consequences were ultimately determined by fate. It's a complex idea, but it kind of makes sense. It's like we're all playing our part in this grand cosmic drama, but we still have some say in how we play that part.
Exactly. And I think that's a pretty powerful message even today. We may not have control over everything that happens to us, but our choices, our actions, they still matter. They still shape who we are.
Yeah, I agree. So the Greek understanding of fate, it wasn't just about passive acceptance. It was about navigating the complexities of life within a framework of destiny. And it was about striving for virtue, even while acknowledging the limits of our control. It's a really nuanced perspective.
Absolutely. And it's one that continues to resonate with us today. We still grapple with these questions, don't we? How much control do we really have over our lives? What's the role of fate, of destiny, in shaping who we are?
Definitely. These are timeless questions. And it's amazing how these ancient myths can still offer us new ways of thinking about them.
I think that's the beauty of mythology. It gives us these timeless stories, these archetypes that we can keep coming back to, keep reinterpreting, keep finding new meaning in.
How did the ancient Greeks actually experience it, like in their daily lives?
It's one thing to talk about philosophy, but it's another to, actually live with this idea that your life is, to some extent, predetermined.
Right.
They recognized the power of fate. They knew that there were some things they just couldn't control. But on the other hand, they didn't just sit back and passively accept whatever happened. Well, one way was through worship. The Moirai, even though they were, associated with death and destiny, they were still goddesses. So people would pray to them, make offerings, try to win their favor.
So that makes sense. And they weren't just afraid of the fates, right? They also respected them.
Absolutely. They understood that fate was a part of life, that it was what gave life meaning and structure.
So it wasn't just about trying to avoid a bad fate. It was about, like, accepting fate as a whole, the good and the bad.
Yeah, I think so. It was about recognizing that fate was woven into the fabric of existence, that it was what made the universe tick.
That's a pretty profound way of looking at it. So did it make them more cautious or more reckless?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I think it probably gave them a sense of perspective. Like, they knew that some things were just out of their hands, but they also knew that they had a role to play in shaping their own destiny.
So they weren't just puppets dancing on the strings of fate.
Right. They were active participants, making choices, taking risks, striving for virtue, and they believed that those choices mattered, even if their ultimate fate was predetermined.
That's a pretty empowering message, actually. It's like you can't control everything, but you can still make the most of what you've got.
Exactly. And I think that's a message that's still relevant today. We live in a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages about control, about how we can achieve anything if we just tried hard enough. But the ancient Greeks understood that there are limits to our control. And maybe accepting those limits is what allows us to truly appreciate the beauty and wonder of life.
I think you're right. It's about finding that balance between accepting what we can't control and making the most of what we can. And it's about recognizing that even in the face of fate, our choices, our actions, they still have meaning. They still shape who we are.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the ultimate lesson we can learn from the Moirai, from the ancient Greek understanding of fate. It's not about giving up, it's about living life to the fullest, embracing the journey, and finding meaning and purpose even in the face of the unknown.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of the Moirai. We've explored their role in Greek mythology, their connection to broader ideas about fate and free will, and how the ancient Greeks tried to make sense of this complex and often paradoxical force in their own lives. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration and that it's given you some food for thought about your own relationship with fate.